The main control of the endocrine system rests with the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland secretes hormones, often called releasing hormones or tropins, that control most of the other glands of the endocrine system. The pituitary itself is attached to the brain directly, and specifically the part of the brain that it is attached to is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, in addition to controlling the autonomic nervous system, is the part of the brain that controls the pituitary gland, and in fact, in some circumstances, makes up part of it. So, structurally speaking, the endocrine system is under the direct control of the brain and the nervous system. So here you can see the organs of the endocrine system, and we'll be going over each of the organs and the hormones that they secrete in order. But you're probably going to want to make some notes because this can get very complicated as everything sort of affects everything else. The pituitary gland itself is actually two different glands that happen to be located together. There's what's called the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is sometimes called the neurohypophysis. Hypophysis is what neurologists call the pituitary gland. It's just a different word for it. And structurally speaking, the anterior pituitary is made out of totally different types of tissue than the posterior pituitary is. In fact, you can see up here nerve projections from the hypothalamus go to what's called the hypophyseal portal system, which is a set of capillaries here. And these neurons they don't release normal neurotransmitters, they actually release hormones. They're going to release hormones into this capillary bed, and that capillary bed will take those hormones directly down to another capillary bed that's in the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus up here has hormonal control over the anterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary is a different story because there are neurons up here, and their somas or cell bodies are up here, and hormones are made up here in the hypothalamus, but then the posterior pituitary actually consists of axonal projections. Basically, it's made out of the axons of a bunch of nerves poking down into this area. So it's actually made out of brain tissue. It's made out of nervous tissue. Those nerves originate in the hypothalamus. And the hormones are made in the cell bodies in the hypothalamus, and then they're going to be secreted down here in the posterior pituitary, where they will get caught up in the capillary system. All right? That's why this is called, the posterior pituitary is sometimes called the neurohypophysis, because it's actually made out of neurons. So we're going to talk about the hypothalamic hormones first, and then we're going to talk about the anterior hormones. The hypothalamic hormones are going to be the ones that are secreted up here into the hypophyseal portal system. And they're going to get carried into the anterior pituitary, where they are going to control it. These hypothalamic hormones are often called releasing hormones. They will stimulate cells in the anterior pituitary to release particular hormones. These hormones from the pituitary, which are often going to be called tropins, or stimulating hormones, are going to go off to the rest of the body and stimulate the production of other hormones. So it's a cascading system. There are 6 main hormones released by the hypothalamus itself. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone, usually called GnRH. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone, which is usually called TRH. Corticotropin-releasing hormone, usually called CRH. Prolactin-inhibiting hormone, PIH. Growth hormone-releasing hormone, or GHRH. And somatostatin. Somatostatin is a little bit of a weird one because it's the only one that is primarily suppressive rather than releasing. So it actually inhibits the release of hormones. Prolactin inhibiting hormone also does that. But a statin and an inhibiting hormone are kind of two different words for the same thing. You can follow the colored lines here and see what hormone each of the hypothalamic hormones is going to affect. Gonadotropin-releasing hormones. Well, what's a gonadotropin? Tropin means stimulating. Your gonads are your testes or your ovaries. And so your gonadotropins are the hormones that stimulate your gonads. That is going to be, and let's put this in green, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. In both male and females, those are the gonadotropins. They're going to stimulate your gonads to produce sex hormones. Testosterone, progesterone, estradiol, and other estrogens. Gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, stimulates your anterior pituitary to release FSH and LH, the more common terms for follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone. What's a thyrotropin? It's going to be a hormone that stimulates the thyroid. And the hormone that stimulates the thyroid is, and let's put this in here in blue, is thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. So, TRH, thyrotropin-releasing hormone, will go down to the anterior pituitary and stimulate the release of TSH, which is thyrotropin. Interestingly, thyrotropin-releasing hormone also stimulates the release of prolactin, usually abbreviated PRL. That's a little bit complicated, and we'll get into it later, but the effects of prolactin, it's not so much a tropin exactly, but it stimulates, in females, it stimulates breast tissue to begin secreting milk, and it also suppresses ovulation. It has various other effects that are secondary in both males and females, but its primary effects are in females. Corticotropin-releasing hormone, CRH, is going to go to the pituitary and stimulate the release of corticotropins. In this case, tropin means stimulating hormone, and cortico refers to the adrenal cortex. So the hormone that's going to be stimulated here is adrenocorticotropic hormone, which you can see there. It's the adrenal cortex stimulating hormone, or ACTH. That's the main hormone that will stimulate your adrenal cortex to produce cortisol and other stress hormones. Prolactin inhibiting hormone has the primary effect of inhibiting prolactin. And that's so that if you want to produce thyroid-stimulating hormone without prolactin, then you would produce both TRH and PIH. Right? So then you would produce thyroid-stimulating hormone, but the PIH would suppress the production of prolactin, which is important because, say, most males have thyroids and need to have their thyroid stimulated to produce thyroid hormone, but an overabundance of prolactin in males will cause the development of breast tissue, and, that's inconvenient most of the time. Growth hormone releasing hormone, which you see up here, GHRH. Guess what that does? It stimulates the release of growth hormone. Which you see down here, growth hormone, usually abbreviated GH. Somatostatin is primarily, somatostatin, which you see up here, is going to suppress growth. Both growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone have effects on the metabolism. They speed up the metabolism and they encourage growth and use of energy. They do so in different ways, but they both do so in very important ways. So if you want to inhibit growth, somatostatin is going to turn down both thyroid-stimulating hormone and growth hormone. This is how your hypothalamus controls the anterior pituitary. Most of these hormones that we just talked about here, the anterior pituitary hormones, they're going to be things that we see in further on down that are going to control most of these other organs over here. To go over that, so follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone are the two gonadotropins. They stimulate the gonads. They're going to have different effects in males and females because you have different gonads in males and females. In females, follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate the development of follicles. And we'll get into exactly what follicles are in the next section. But these are the structures that surround developing eggs before they're ovulated. So it's going to move eggs down the path towards ovulation, and it's going to stimulate the secretion of sex hormones, primarily estradiol and estrogens. Luteinizing hormone, or LH, in females is going to stimulate ovulation, the release of the egg, and it's going to stimulate a body called the corpus luteum, which is the follicle after ovulation, to secrete progesterone, which is a female sex hormone that prepares the body for pregnancy. These two hormones have different functions in males. In males, follicle-stimulating hormone is going to stimulate cells in the testes to produce a protein called androgen binding protein, which will concentrate the local levels of testosterone, and that is involved in getting levels of testosterone high enough to produce sperm. So FSH is necessary for stimulating the testes to produce sperm. LH does not directly stimulate the production of sperm, but in males it stimulates the testes to secrete testosterone, which is necessary for sperm production. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormone from the thyroids. Most of these have pretty logical names if you pay attention to them. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex. And specifically, it stimulates the adrenal cortex to secrete glucocorticoids, which are primarily stress hormones. Prolactin, as I said, it has a whole host of secondary effects, particularly on brain structure and development, but its primary function in women is to stimulate mammary glands to produce milk, and it's also involved in the suppression of ovulation post-pregnancy. If you breastfeed, it has a contraceptive effect, and should, if done in the right way, prevent you from having another child while the child you have is still breastfeeding. We'll get into the specifics of that later. Growth hormone stimulates mitosis and cellular differentiation. It's necessary for, well, growth, but also for repair. The posterior pituitary. Now, recall what I said. The hormones of the posterior pituitary are not made in the posterior pituitary. They're made in the hypothalamus. They're hypothalamic hormones. But they're sent down the projection axons that make up the posterior pituitary, and then they're released in the posterior pituitary. There are two main hormones produced by the posterior pituitary. ADH, sometimes called vasopressin. It stands for antidiuretic hormone. A diuretic is something that makes you pee. Diuresis is the release of water from the body. Antidiuretic hormone is something that makes you retain water, so you pee less. Antidiuretic hormone is necessary, absolutely, to the maintenance of water in your body. Water is very important. If you lack antidiuretic hormone, you end up with a condition called diabetes insipidus, where basically you produce massive quantities of urine all day long, and you basically pee yourself to death. You dehydrate. So this is an absolutely essential hormone for preventing dehydration. It also acts as a vasoconstrictor at high levels, and so that's why it's called vasopressin, because it increases vasoconstriction and it increases blood volume. All of those things will increase blood pressure. Oxytocin is a interesting hormone that has a great many effects. It has a huge number of effects on the brain and cognition and brain development and how you make decisions, and all of those are only beginning to be well understood. It is most famous for being the hormone that stimulates labor contractions during childbirth. And for a long time, we thought that was what it did. But we were unsure because, males produce a significant amount of oxytocin. It seems to be doing something in males. Males, not so much with the childbirth. It also was known to stimulate the flow of milk during lactation, right? It doesn't stimulate the production of milk, but rather milk letdown. And so, those are the two easy to explain effects of oxytocin. The other effects of oxytocin have to do with emotional bonding, promotion of good in-group feelings and forgiveness, and also promotion of out-group intolerance. Oxytocin is produced at high levels during sexual arousal and orgasm, and is thought to play a role in pair bonding. It's part of the hormonal cause of, that kind of giddy falling in love feeling. It's released at high levels post-orgasm, promotes feelings of sexual satisfaction and emotional bonding between partners. It's also produced at high levels during childbirth, right? Because it's stimulating contractions. And it's thought that it is part of what establishes the emotional bonding between mother and infant. That, you just give birth, your body is basically awash in tons and tons of oxytocin, and that's going to cause you to form an emotional bond with whatever's around, which is typically your baby. Interestingly, men who are present at the birth of their child also experience a flood of oxytocin, even though they're not undergoing labor contractions and there's no physiological reason why they would need it. They also get that rush of oxytocin, which does promote pair bonding and bonding with the child, but only if they're present during the process. This is reinforced in women because oxytocin is, of course, released every time you nurse your infant. And so this is part of the idea behind, nursing your infant promotes pair bonding. I should also point out that, it isn't that's the only things that cause oxytocin release. Anytime you look at your child, or even look at a child, oxytocin is released. Oxytocin is released when you pet your cat or your dog. When you think about your family, oxytocin is released. It promotes feelings of goodwill and benevolence towards people who you know and love and trust and consider to be part of your group or tribe. It also promotes suspicion and negative behavior towards people who you don't consider to be part of your tribe, and will increase your likelihood to look badly on people who are different from you. So it's a complicated hormone with a complicated history. So in summary, the brain controls the endocrine system through the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus controls the endocrine system through directly controlling the posterior pituitary, because it actually makes up the posterior pituitary, and indirectly controlling the anterior pituitary through the release of releasing hormones.